Being a pharaoh of ancient Egypt would seem pretty sweet. You'd get to live in a palace, have all the gold you could ever need, and rule over one of the most advanced civilizations in the ancient world. But being a pharaoh had its downsides too. Here are 5 reasons why it sucked to be an Egyptian pharaoh. No. 1. People expected you to live forever. The Egyptians kept track of their history through genealogy, much like the way we do today. However, unlike us, they believed that their pharaohs were divine, and therefore immortal. This belief led them to document the ancestry of every pharaoh, back to the mythical first king, Minos, who supposedly ruled in the 34th century BC. They also believed that the pharaoh was directly descended from the sun god Ra, which made him closer to a god than a man. As such, they expected their pharaohs to live forever, at least until they died. But even death wasn't the end for an Egyptian pharaoh, because after this life, he would move on to an afterlife that was just as opulent as his life on earth. Unfortunately, there was one catch. To enjoy the afterlife, the pharaoh needed to remain in it. He couldn't join his ancestors in the hall of the final judgment unless his body was preserved properly. And the only way to do that was to mummify him. So when an Egyptian pharaoh died, he didn't get to rest in peace. Instead, his servants wrapped his body in linen, stuffed it with resin and spices, and put him in a coffin made out of gold or granite before encasing him in a tomb that was built to keep him safe from grave robbers. Now, imagine the pressure of knowing that if your body wasn't treated correctly, you wouldn't be able to enter the afterlife. That's what every single pharaoh had to deal with throughout their reign. And it didn't matter whether they died from natural causes or were assassinated by their own son. If the burial rites weren't performed correctly, they wouldn't rest in peace. Number 2, assassination was a common way to change pharaohs. While the Egyptians had a word for murder, they never used it to describe the removal of a pharaoh from power. The closest thing to murder was when a new pharaoh came into power through inheritance. Even then, it was still considered to be a peaceful transfer of power. However, not all transfers of power were peaceful, especially during the New Kingdom when Egypt became more centralized and powerful. During this time, the vizier, general, and priests had a lot of influence and power. So when a pharaoh passed away, these people would often try to take control by crowning the pharaoh as infant son and then ruling his regents. But other times, they would go a step further. Sometimes the vizier or general would usurp the throne for themselves, either by killing the sitting pharaoh or convincing the people that the pharaoh had been deposed by a foreign invader. Most famously, Queen Hatshepsut was murdered by her own stepson, Thutmose III, after he took the throne from her. According to the records, she had commissioned too many building projects and spent too much money on foreign trade. When Thutmose III came into power, he erased all records of Hatshepsut's reign and claimed that she wasn't really pharaoh at all, but just a regent. Clearly, it was a hostile takeover. No. 3. It was difficult to please everyone. Ancient Egypt is remembered today as a civilization that brought us some of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. Great works of engineering, such as the pyramids and temples, dotted the landscape, while advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine put the Egyptians ahead of their time. However, the Egyptians were a polytheistic society, meaning that they believed in more than one god. In fact, they worshipped hundreds of gods, each with their own personality, domain, and whims. So it was very difficult to please all of them. Not only that, but they were also very particular about how they were worshipped. For example, each god had their own sacred animals, so animal sacrifices were required. If the wrong animal was sacrificed to the wrong god, it could anger that deity and lead to natural disasters, disease, and war. Similarly, if a pharaoh neglected to build a temple or erect a statue in honor of a certain god, that god may turn against him and cause chaos in the kingdom. It wasn't enough to just appease the gods with sacrifices and statues. Pharaohs also had to make sure that their subjects did the same. One of the main duties of a pharaoh was to ensure that justice was served. And a big part of that was making sure that people followed religious laws. If someone was found guilty of neglecting religious duties, the pharaoh might have to punish them. For example, in one case, a scribe named Ptahceres was put to death for denying the divinity of the pharaoh and failing to perform his religious duties. While this punishment seems harsh by today's standards, it was actually pretty lenient. Other times, the punishment for neglecting religious duties was much more gruesome. In one instance, a man named Khnum-hotep was sentenced to death for stealing sacred incense and was executed by having molten gold poured down his throat. No, pharaohs frequently went to war. While today we think of Egypt as a land of peace and tranquility, that wasn't always the case. In fact, ancient Egypt was a warlike society, and pharaohs frequently went to war. The reason for this is simple. The survival of the Egyptian civilization depended on having access to the Nile River and its annual floods. When the floods were strong, the river would overflow its banks and deposit silt on the surrounding land, which would make it very fertile. However, if the floods were weak or didn't happen at all, then crops would fail and people would starve. So it was in the pharaoh's best interest to control as much of the Nile River basin as possible. Unfortunately, there were other groups of people who wanted the same thing. So the Egyptians were constantly fighting wars with neighboring kingdoms. Some of the most famous pharaohs, such as Ramesses II, Thutmose III, and Hatshepsut, came into power because they either started or finished a war that expanded Egypt's territory. However, going to war also had its downsides. When a pharaoh went to war, he had to leave the palace and actually do something himself. Typically, pharaohs preferred to stay in the palace and let their servants and advisors do the work for them. Being a good pharaoh meant keeping everything running smoothly, and that included keeping the peace. But when there was a war to be fought, the pharaoh couldn't just hide in the palace. He had to suit up and lead his army into battle. And if he wasn't careful, he could end up dead. In fact, some pharaohs were killed in battle. One of the most famous examples is Pharaoh Akhenaten, who may have been killed during a chariot race while he was wearing his armor. And no, 5, there was no job security. If we go back to the days of the pharaohs, we can see that they were in charge of running Egypt. They had absolute power over their subjects and were considered to be divine. However, they didn't have any job security. At any given time, a pharaoh's position was tenuous. There was always the risk that he would be overthrown by his own son or another member of the royal court. Even worse, sometimes they would be overthrown by the very people who were supposed to protect them. In fact, there were several instances where the Egyptian pharaohs were killed by their own wives. For example, King Tut's wife, Ankhesenamun, is believed to have poisoned him after he died unexpectedly at the age of 19. Another infamous case was that of Cleopatra, who was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. When Cleopatra came to power, she had to share it with her younger sister, Arsinoe IV. And things didn't end well between them. According to Plutarch, Arsinoe IV tried to kill Cleopatra by sending assassins to poison her. When Cleopatra survived the attempt on her life, she retaliated by killing Arsinoe IV's son. Later, when Ptolemy XIII came to power, he tried to assert his authority over Cleopatra. She responded by having him killed along with his wife Bernice. Now, while these cases of fratricide and matricide are extreme, they do show that a pharaoh's position was never secure. There were always people around him who wanted more power and were willing to do whatever it took to get it. So ultimately, being an Egyptian pharaoh was a dangerous job. They had to watch out for jealous family members, powerful servants, and even their own wives. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out our other content where we explore the ancient world like never before. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an exciting episode.